back in his luxurious penthouse. Felix poured himself a drink, his jaw tight with frustration. His mother's words still rang in his head. If you don't find a serious woman to marry, you'll lose your inheritance. He couldn't afford that, but every woman around him only wanted his money. Then he remembered Amanda's desperate plea. He wasn't stupid. He had met too many women who played the damsel in distress card, hoping to get their hands on his money. But there was something different about Amanda. She wasn't dressed seductively like the women who usually threw themselves at him. Her eyes weren't filled with admiration or hunger for wealth. They were filled with rage, desperation, and something else he couldn't quite place. Still, she had insulted him, and Felix never helped women who disrespected him. Or so he told himself. Meanwhile, Amanda's face was burning with anger and humiliation. The way he had laughed at her, mocked her desperation, made her blood boil. She sat in the dim hospital room, holding Daniel's hand. Her friend Susan had gone out to get food for them, when suddenly she noticed Daniel's breathing change. Panic surged through her as she rushed to call the nurses. The doctor arrived quickly and managed to stabilize him. Then he turned to Amanda and asked if the money was ready. With a heavy heart, she shook her head. Amanda's hands trembled as she reached for her phone with one last shred of hope. She quickly dialed her father's number, her fingers slick with sweat. It rang once, twice. Then a voice answered, but it wasn't her father's. "What do you want, Amanda?" her father's new wife asked. Amanda swallowed the lump in her throat. "Please put my dad on the phone," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "What for?" the woman scoffed. "It's Daniel. He's been in an accident. He's in critical condition, and we need money for surgery. Please, I'm begging you, just let me talk to him." There was silence on the other end. Then Amanda heard it, her father's voice in the background. "Who is it?" "It's Amanda," his wife replied, her tone indifferent. "She's asking for money." A pause. Then his voice cold and detached. "Tell her not to call here again. I don't have money to waste on anyone." Amanda's breath caught in her throat. The words sliced through her like a blade. And then, click, the line went dead. She stared at the phone in her hand, disbelief washing over her. Her own father, the man who had once carried her on his shoulders, who had once kissed Daniel goodnight, had turned his back on them. A strangled sob tore from her throat as the weight of hopelessness crushed her. She pressed her forehead against the cold hospital floor, her body shaking. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Somebody help me." But the world remained, and Daniel's time was running out. Her friend Susan came back and saw her crying. She sat beside her when she heard what happened. "You should go back to Felix," Susan urged. "Beg if you have to." Amanda clenched her fists. "He threw me out like trash." "Then make him want you," Susan said, leaning in. "Felix is a womanizer, right? They only stay interested when they feel like they're chasing someone they can't easily have. I used to work at a hotel he often visited, and I saw how he treated women." Amanda's stomach twisted. Could she really manipulate him? She looked at her brother, his pale face motionless. She had no choice. The next evening, Amanda walked into a high-end bar where Felix and his rich friends often gathered. She had no money for fancy drinks, but she wasn't here for that. Dressed in a simple yet elegant dress, she exuded quiet confidence. She wasn't throwing herself at Felix. She was here to be seen, to make him wonder. Amanda could feel Felix's gaze burning into her, but she refused to look at him. Her plan was simple. If he wouldn't help her willingly, she'd make him want to. She turned to Adrian, laughing at his joke, though she barely heard it. She wasn't here for him. She was here for Felix. It worked, because moments later, Felix was standing beside her, his voice dripping with irritation. "I didn't know you had such cheap taste." Amanda turned, feigning surprise. "Felix? What a coincidence." Felix smirked, but there was no humor in his eyes. I thought you were desperate for money. Or did Adrian here offer to buy you? Adrian frowned. Back off, Felix. She's with me. Amanda saw the muscle in Felix's jaw tighten. He was jealous. Good. I didn't know you cared, she said sweetly. Felix leaned in, his voice low. But you don't belong with him. Amanda arched her brow. And I belonged with you? You laughed at me when I begged for help. Felix's smirk faded. He hated being reminded of that moment. Stay away from Adrian, he muttered before walking away. Amanda exhaled. She had cracked him. Now, she just had to make him break. Back in his family house, Felix downed a glass of whiskey, but the alcohol didn't wash away his irritation. Amanda's voice still rang in his ears. Please, I'll do anything. My brother, he's dying. He had seen desperation before, but hers had cut through him in a way he wasn't used to. It wasn't fake. It wasn't a game. And yet, he had thrown her out. Because if he gave in to one woman's tears, what was left of him? But why couldn't he shake off the memory of her eyes? Then he walked into his father's study. The scent of old books and cigars thick in the air. The leather chair beneath him felt cold, just like the man who used to sit in it. His fingers traced the edge of the mahogany desk, memories clawing at him like ghosts. He was 16 when his father shattered his world. You are weak, Felix, his father had said that day, standing tall in his perfectly pressed suit, his voice sharp as a knife. Crying over a damn dog? You embarrass me. Felix had clutched the lifeless body of Rex, the only thing in the world that had ever loved him without conditions. His father's car had hit the dog, but the man didn't even blink. He simply stepped over the body and walked into the house, leaving Felix in the rain, soaked and shaking. That was the moment something inside him changed. He learned that love was a weakness, that needing someone meant giving him the power to hurt you. So he stopped needing. He built walls sharp and high, making sure no one ever got close enough to break him again. Women became a game. Emotions became a lie he told with a smile. But now, as he sat in the very chair his father once ruled from, he felt the weight of everything he had lost. He had spent years proving he was strong. Yet here he was, rich, powerful, and utterly alone. A hollow laugh escaped his lips. Maybe his father had won after all. Meanwhile, the next morning, Amanda received a call from an unknown number. I'll give you the money. Felix's voice came through the line. Her heart leaped, but she kept her voice steady. Really? What changed? Felix chuckled darkly. Let's just say I don't like seeing things that belong to me in someone else's hands. Amanda's stomach twisted. I don't belong to you, Felix. Silence. Then he said, meet me today. Midnight. I will send the driver to pick you. Then the line went dead. Felix had sent his personal assistant to investigate Amanda and discovered that she was telling the truth about her brother. Later that day, Amanda sat on the plush hotel couch, her fingers gripping the edge of her dress. She had no idea why Felix had asked to meet here, but she knew one thing: she had to stay calm. Felix strolled in, looking as effortless as ever, dressed in a crisp white shirt with the top buttons undone. He smirked as he took a seat across from her. I didn't think you'd actually come, he said, swirling the drink in his hand. Amanda met his gaze. You told me to. His smirk deepened. You look nervous. She straightened her back. I'm fine. Felix watched her for a moment, then exhaled. Stay the night with me. Her stomach twisted. Felix, He cut her off with a lazy chuckle. Relax, Amanda. No one's forcing you. I need a shower. He stood, stretching slightly before walking toward the bathroom. Make yourself comfortable. As soon as the door closed behind him, Amanda let out a shaky breath. Then she saw it. A thick stack of cash sat on the table beside his wallet. Crisp bills neatly arranged. Enough money to save Daniel. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She stood, eyes locked on the money. Taking it would be stealing. Felix would never forgive her. But if she left without it, Daniel could die. Her hands trembled as she reached for the envelope. The moment her fingers touched the money, guilt clawed at her chest. No time for guilt. The sound of running water reminded her that she had seconds, maybe less. She snatched the money, stuffed it into her purse, and bolted for the door. Her heels clicked against the marble floor as she rushed down the hallway, pushing past guests, her breath coming in sharp gasps. By the time she reached the exit, her hands were shaking so badly she struggled to flag down a cab. A car finally pulled up. She jumped in. "St. Mercy Hospital," she said barely, able to breathe. As the car sped off, she clutched her purse against her chest, her heart slamming against her ribs. She had done it. Daniel was going to live. But Felix? He was going to come for her. Meanwhile, Amanda rushed to the hospital, desperate to pay for Daniel's surgery with the stolen money. But to her shock, the nurse gave her a puzzled look. "Miss, the bill has already been paid." Amanda froze. What? "Yes," the nurse confirmed. "An anonymous donor cleared the entire amount a few hours ago." Her pulse stuttered. She should have been relieved. Her brother was safe. But instead, dread coiled in her stomach like a snake. Felix? It had to be him. And she had just stolen from the very man who had already saved her brother. Her knees nearly buckled as she staggered back from the desk, her mind spinning. If Felix had paid, was he already looking for her? Had she just destroyed any chance of repaying his kindness? A strangled breath left her lips. No, she didn't have time to panic. Right now, she had to be there for Daniel. Everything else, she'd deal with it later. Felix stared at the empty table in his hotel suite, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. She took the money. The woman had the audacity to steal from him and then run. Felix let out a bitter chuckle as he loosened his tie and poured himself a drink. He should have known. He had dealt with women like her before, women who cried, begged, and played the innocent act, only to stab him in the back the moment they got the chance. But why did it bother him this much? He drained the glass in one gulp, but the burning liquor didn't wash away the image of Amanda's desperate eyes. The way she had trembled in front of him. The way she had hesitated before taking the money. Something didn't add up. If she were just another gold digger, she wouldn't have been so afraid. She wouldn't have looked so broken. Felix exhaled sharply and reached for his phone. "Find out everything about Amanda's brother," he instructed his assistant. "I want to know where she is. Now." Amanda sat by Daniel's bedside, holding his frail hand as the machines beeped softly around them. The surgery had gone well, and for the first time in weeks, she could breathe. He was safe, but her relief was short-lived. The moment she stepped out into the hospital corridor, she saw them. 2 men in black suits, standing by the entrance, watching her. Felix's men, her stomach twisted into knots. She had expected this, but she wasn't ready. With a deep breath, she squared her shoulders and walked toward them. "Mr. Felix wants to see you," one of them said, his tone unreadable. Amanda swallowed hard. Running wasn't an option. She nodded. "Let me just check on my brother one last time." A few minutes later, she was in the back seat of a sleek black car, heading toward an unknown fate. Felix sat in his penthouse, watching the city lights flicker through the massive windows when the door opened. Amanda walked in, her chin lifted despite the fear in her eyes. His gaze roamed over her, searching for guilt, defiance, anything that would tell him why she had done it. She didn't speak first. "Smart." "So," he said, leaning back against the couch. "You're a terrible thief. Amanda, you stole from me." Amanda flinched, but stood her ground. "I didn't have a choice." Felix let out a dark laugh. "There's always a choice, sweetheart. And you chose the wrong one." She swallowed hard. "I was desperate." He studied her, silent for a long moment. Then he stood, closing the space between them. Amanda held her breath as he reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. His touch was light, almost gentle, but his eyes, they were sharp, calculating. "I should call the police," he murmured. or I could make your life very, very difficult. Amanda's fists clenched. Then why haven't you? Felix smirked. Because I have a better idea. Her stomach dropped. What do you want? His eyes gleamed with something unreadable. You need money. I need a wife. Amanda's breath caught. What? Felix shrugged. It's simple. My mother is threatening to cut me off unless I settle down. I need a wife to keep my inheritance. You need security for your brother. Marry me. Amanda's head spun. This had to be a joke. I can't marry you. Felix arched his brow. Then I suppose your brother's medical expenses will suddenly become complicated. Amanda's heart pounded. He was blackmailing her, trapping her. But the worst part? She had no way out. Tears burned at the back of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't let him see her break. Fine, she said through clenched teeth. I'll marry you. Felix smirked, victory flashing in his eyes. Good girl. The wedding was nothing like Amanda had ever dreamed of. There was no love in Felix's gaze, no tenderness in his touch. The ceremony was grand, a lavish display of wealth, but beneath the surface, it was nothing more than a transaction. Amanda stood beside Felix, her fingers trembling as she held onto his arm. The weight of her reality pressed down on her. She was now the wife of a man who had mocked her, rejected her, and only married her to satisfy his mother's demand. Felix, on the other hand, felt trapped. He had spent years avoiding commitment, keeping his heart guarded behind steel walls. Yet, here he was bound to a woman he barely knew, one who had defied him, insulted him, and now shared his last name. That night, in their extravagant bedroom, Amanda sat at the edge of the bed, her heart pounding. Felix poured himself a drink, leaning against the dresser, watching her with unreadable eyes. You don't have to act like a scared rabbit, he said, his voice laced with amusement. I have no interest in touching a woman who hates me. Amanda lifted her chin, refusing to let him see how nervous she was. Good, because I have no interest in being touched by a man who thinks everything can be bought. Felix smirked but said nothing. He finished his drink and left the room, slamming the door behind him. Days turned into weeks, and despite their cold marriage, something unexpected happened. Felix began to notice her. He saw the way she cared for Daniel, how she stayed up all night by his side, reading to him, feeding him, holding his hand when he was in pain. She wasn't just a woman desperate for money. She was a sister who would do anything for her brother. That kind of love was foreign to Felix, who had grown up in a world where emotions were weaknesses and attachments were dangerous. And then there was her laughter. It wasn't forced or hollow like the women he was used to. It was real, warm, and filled with life. Even in a loveless marriage, even with the weight of her circumstances, Amanda still found moments to laugh with Daniel, to smile at Susan, to appreciate the little things. Felix hated how much he noticed. One evening, he walked into the living room and saw her playing a board game with Daniel. She was laughing so hard she had tears in her eyes, while Daniel grinned weakly, enjoying the moment despite his illness. Felix stood frozen at the doorway. His entire life, he had believed love was an illusion. But in that moment, he wondered, was it possible he had been wrong? Then Felix fell ill. It started with a fever, then body aches, so intense he could barely move. He tried to shake it off, but his condition worsened until he collapsed in his office. Amanda found him burning up, his face pale and drenched in sweat. Felix, she gasped, rushing to his side. He groaned, barely able to lift his head. Leave me alone, he muttered weakly. But she didn't. She called the doctor, helped him into bed, and sat beside him, pressing a cold cloth to his forehead. When he shivered, she pulled the blankets over him. When he moaned in pain, she held his hand. For 2 days, she barely left his side. Felix, in his fevered state, was too weak to argue. He had never been taken care of like this before, not by his father, not by any of the women he had been with. No one had ever looked at him with worry, with genuine concern. But Amanda did. Through the haze of his sickness, he felt her presence, her gentle hands, her soothing voice. And for the first time in years, Felix didn't feel alone. By the third day, his fever finally broke. He opened his eyes to find Amanda asleep beside him, her head resting on the bed, her hand still holding his. He stared at her, something tightening in his chest. She should hate him. She had every reason to, but she was still here. Felix lifted a hand, hesitated, then gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. She stirred, blinking up at him. "You're awake," she said, relief flooding her eyes. He swallowed, his throat dry. "You stayed." Amanda sat up. "Of course I did." Felix didn't understand the warmth that spread through him at her words. He only knew that for the first time in a long time, he didn't want to push someone away. And that terrified him. As the days passed, Felix found himself changing. He no longer entertained meaningless flings. The idea of another woman in his arms felt wrong. He found himself drawn to Amanda in ways he couldn't explain, watching her when she wasn't looking, listening to her laugh, craving her presence in the quiet moments of the night. One evening, as they sat on the balcony, Amanda turned to him and asked, "Why did you marry me, Felix?" "Really?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at her. The woman who had challenged him, fought him, and yet cared for him when he was at his weakest. "I don't know anymore," he admitted. Amanda's breath caught in her throat. Neither of them said another word, but something shifted between them that night. Something unspoken. Something dangerous. And Felix knew he had fallen for his wife, whether he wanted to or not.